You may not have had a chance to see this yet, but I am about an hour and 12 minutes into the Doug Wilson, Joe Rigney versus Jon Speed and T. Russell Hunter debate on abortion. Wilson and Rigney are smash-mouth incrementalists, and Speed and Hunter are abolitionists. And so the debate essentially is, what means or methods should we be okay with as we seek to end abortion? Both sides are Christian, for Christian men. All four of them, as I understand, want abortion to end, not just quote-unquote legally. We don't want abortion to happen at all. None of us want murder to occur. I think I can say that for all four of those men. But the debate is, how do we go about reaching that goal? Wilson and Rigney say it is acceptable to promote, support, if you're a legislator or governor, endorse, sign legislation that codifies what Hunter and Speed would say is injustice. Namely, for example, a heartbeat bill that says it is unjust, or it is wrong, it is illegal, I should say, it is illegal to kill a child after 6 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever. The idea being that this legislation will then be used, and this is true, will then be used as justification for the murder of a child at 4 weeks or 5 weeks. Speed and Hunter remonstrate against that and say this is exactly the thing that God forbids us from doing. If not exactly, it's certainly appropriate to apply God's prohibition against decreeing iniquitous decrees to this concept of crafting legislation that is used to justify the murder of children. Wilson and Rigney say, well, it's just a means to an end, and it's going to get the ball down the field. Now, I'm not going to rehash the whole debate. It actually is getting a little heated right now, and that's good to have these discussions to get a little heated and go at each other, because T. Russell Hunter is really kind of going after Doug Wilson as a leader of what he would call the smash-mouth incrementalist position, and Hunter is saying that Doug Wilson is really opposing the abolitionist movement. Wilson kind of says he's not, and so that's an interesting exchange. I'm not sure how much it deals with the actual point, but maybe it does. But as I'm listening to these four Christian brothers, and I don't know any of them. I have spoken on the phone to Jon Speed at least once, maybe twice, but I don't know any of these guys personally, really, beyond that. But I appreciate all four of their work. So it's not like I have a dog in the race in terms of one of these men. I do find myself more aligned with the abolitionist side because there are elements of that I think align with Lancastrian theonomy. But I actually think, and this is the comment I want to make, I actually think this kind of reveals one of the reasons that we promote as theonomists, especially at Future of Christendom, the idea that we don't need man-made legislation. Because here you have T. Russell Hunter and Jon Speed debating Doug Wilson and Joe Rigney about what? They're debating about how to use this system of man-made legislation. And so in one sense, I think the debate from the get-go, it's a false start. If we're going to frame it in the context of the American legislative humanistic system, not just American, I can kind of understand either side. I mean, again, I'm partial to the abolitionists because I agree with them that I don't want to stand before God and say, I put my name to something that justifies evil or injustice. Wilson and Rigney are going to say, well, this is the system we have, and so we're going to use it. In one sense, Speed and Hunter are almost to the point, they're not there yet, they're almost to the point to say, well, you know what, that is the problem, we reject this whole system, but that's not what they're doing. And so that's why I think the entire debate is still framed in the context of man-made legislation. And that's really, I don't think that should be the debate, because here's the question. What is it going to take? I guess the debate between them is, what is it going to take to get a law on the books that says abortion is illegal? That's their debate. What we argue as theonomists, what I argue, and there are others as well, is that we actually don't need another law about abortion. We don't need a more specific law that deals with the age at which you are able to murder someone. We believe as theonomists, specifically as Lancastrian theonomists, that God's law is enough to establish justice. What you need are people willing to apply it. Now you could say, well, Chris, that's just punting. You're just punting the issue down the road. Of course, if we had everybody who would follow God's law, then we wouldn't need all this stuff. And that's not addressing the issue. But I actually think it is, because even in our system right now, the more laws you get passed, the more loopholes you create. So Speed and Hunter are doing their level best, I believe, within the man-made system to act as theonomists, and I commend them. And again, I'm mostly with them in terms of the argumentation here. They're doing the best they can with the theonomic position, with the biblical position within the man-made system. And so they're kicking against the goads, obviously, from the Republicans or conservatives, but even in this debate, to a degree, against Doug Wilson and Joe Rigney, they're finding it very difficult in this man-made system to establish justice. And that is precisely what we argue for as theonomists, that we are not called to use man's system to establish justice. God has given us both his law and the system of justice that we need to establish justice. So we all know, whether or not we have God's system in place or man's, that there will still be people who commit murder. There will still be people who commit abortions. Now, obviously, the goal and the hope is that that will lessen and lessen, not just as we have righteous people who will establish justice. That's huge. But also as the Spirit of God moves and changes people's hearts, so they don't want to murder their children. Both of those things can happen together. So murders and abortions will lessen by the grace of God, but it can happen in any system. The question regarding how do we end it, I don't think you can honestly have that debate without dealing with the theonomic proposition, specifically the proposition that we don't need more man-made legislation to end abortion, right? We don't need better legislation to end abortion. We need to establish God's law. If we have God's law as a standard and godly magistrates, then abortion is de facto outlawed. Child sacrifice is de facto outlawed. Now, you can push back on that and say, well, that's not going to happen. Well, we could say the same thing about the American system. In order for it to be abolished, even in Speed and Hunter's vision, what you need is godly magistrates and godly people who will then enforce whatever abolitionist bill they want in place. And again, I think both sides are genuine in their desire, but I do think this debate reveals one of the reasons why we should actually step back and ask the deeper question. Why do we have the legislative branch to begin with? It's actually making this, the entire debate should be about why are we not establishing justice and why are people murdering each other in our nation? And it's being shifted to, well, the problem is the law. The problem is the law. The problem are the laws that the legislators have put forth. In one sense, that's true because we have, but at the deeper level, it's the system that has been embraced. So as Americans are continually taught, and here's the problem, the churches teach this, the pastors teach the American people that we have to continue to operate in this system and we have to prop it up and we have to vote for it every year and we have to continue to believe that the solution to making America better, whether it's this issue or any other issue, the solution is more legislation. And I'm convinced as long as we continue to have that debate, we're going to continue to spin the wheels on justice. Now, I'm not saying anything's going to happen overnight, but I would prefer the debate to be, why are we relying on a legislature to establish justice? And this is just a friendly critique of the abolitionists. I mean, I commend you. I support what you're doing. Child sacrifice. I'm generally with you, but I'm just saying, if you want to talk about strategy and the long-term implications of the Christian worldview spreading, we have to be addressing this question of, are we teaching people to question the legislature from the beginning? Or are we saying, look, our only solution here, the way we're going to establish justice and end child sacrifice, i.e. abortion, is to get better laws passed? I think we're actually missing a more pragmatic, more powerful, and more biblical approach. And that is to reach the people with the message that it's the legislative system itself that has diverted our attention away from our duty. And now all our focus is on how can we get the right legislation passed. I think the legislators, the GOP, the Democrats, any of them, I think they would much rather be in that position where you have Doug Wilson, Joe Rigney, and Jon Speed and T. Russell Hunter, who I think all four of those are godly men as far as I can tell, and would be a threat to these I think the legislators would be happy to have Christians debating how we can go about getting the laws we want passed, as opposed to Christians coming together and say, we reject this entire system of man-made legislation. And it's going to take time and generations, but we are going to teach the next generation and the next generation how to undermine this man-made system and actually establish justice. And I think that's missed in the entire debate, at least what I've heard so far between these four men. The debate is basically, is it right to create legislation that establishes injustice? And again, I largely agree with Speed and Hunter, but they're not debating whether or not we should even be seeking to make legislation, because that's the deeper question. We already have the law of God, thou shalt not murder. And I'll just say this to close. What happens with man-made legislation is people say, well, that's not enough, Chris, because what we have now is people say, well, abortion's not murder. And so we need the extra legislation in order to safeguard against people that will come along and say, well, yeah, it says don't murder, but this is not murder because this fetus is not a human being. The same argument could be made for somebody who says, well, I'm going to murder my neighbor because they're not fully human because of X, Y, or Z. So you could make the same argument and say, well, we need more legislation. But what happens inevitably when we embrace the legislative system is you create loopholes. And so this Speed and Hunter, I think, would generally agree with this, but their solution is, well, we just need to make even better legislation that is even clearer, more clear than we could possibly, anything on the books now. We need it crystal clear that this includes children in the womb. And I get their desire. I commend their desire. I applaud it. But I think it's a losing battle. And I don't think it's something that God calls us to. I don't think God calls us to try to get the legislation changed in our nation. He calls us to establish justice. He's already given us his law. And I think we actually waste our energy with all these campaigns to get new legislation passed. Imagine the impact of the professing church in America if she devoted her attention in the political realm, it's not the only realm, to educating the entire nation on the uselessness of the legislative branch and nullifying these things. Then you would have an increasing undercurrent of people who are seeking to govern biblically. And I think once that would reach a critical mass, there would be a decision point made. Do we continue to follow this system, the man-made system, or do we embrace biblical law? That's what happened in the Reformation. Enough people said, you know what? We reject the papal system, and we are now going to have to do this on our own. And there was some growing pains, some serious growing pains, and there were some issues. But I believe in the end it was a net positive because they abandoned the man-made system for the biblical form. And I believe that's what we need to do when it comes to the abortion issue. This will not be solved by more man-made legislation. This will be solved by the application of God's law. Now, there's still practical ways to get there and means we need to take, but none of those can contravene or should contravene or contradict God's standard of justice. So if you haven't watched this debate between Wilson, Rigney, Speed, and Hunter, I encourage you to check it out. Put your comments here. Let me know what you think. Do you think that man-made legislation is going to solve the abortion issue? Or should we, as abolitionists, as Christians, be focused on abolishing abortion via God's law? Now, when we say abolish, again, we want it to end. How is it going to happen? And so that's the question. And let's continue to talk about it. Let's have these discussions. And I hope I hope there's more debates like this. This one is pretty interesting to listen to. But I do think it misses, it buries the lead. The elephant in the room, to me, is we're debating man-made legislation. And I just think the man-made legislators are happy for Christians to be spinning their wheels on that, because I think they have the upper hand. The statists have the upper hand when it comes to playing that game. So thanks for listening. Share your thoughts. God bless. Have a great weekend.